And welcome to the Rob Kall Bottom Up Radio Show, WNJC 1360 AM, sponsored by opednews.com. Tonight, my guest is Paul Craig Roberts. Paul has quite a history. He's had careers in scholarship and academia, public service, and journalism. He served in the congressional staff as an assistant secretary of the Treasury. He's written for the Washington Times, the Wall Street Journal. It's a pretty illustrious list of things that Paul has done over the years. And Paul's been a writer, a contributor for Op-Ed News for a couple years, too. And he wrote a piece on March 24th titled, "Goodbye, Truth Has Fallen and Has Taken Liberty with It." And at the end of the article, he says, "As the pen is censored and its might extinguished, I am signing off." Now, welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you, Rob.
That was a disappointing ending, considering that your voice is an important one. And yet I can. The article clearly expresses your frustration. You want to talk a little bit about what went into that article?
Oh, well, yes. Lots of things just sort of came together. One, I'm getting on in years and getting tired. Another is I just sort of came to the general conclusion that it was futile, and I can go into that a bit. And also, I was repeating myself. You know, for years, I've been making the point that offshoring destroys the United States economy and the career prospects for tens of millions of Americans and the career prospects of future generations. And all the economic prospects of these tens of millions of Americans are ruined just in order to benefit a very tiny handful of super rich people. And, you know, I've made that point over and over, relating it to every kind of economic news report and so on and so on. And yet, it goes nowhere. And even sites that like my columns, like various libertarian sites like Lou Rockwell, antiwar.com, they would refuse to even publish my economic columns because they have this sort of crazy idea that offshoring is free trade and we're benefiting. And it was a form of mindlessness that just sort of eventually wore me out. And I think I've also repeated myself endlessly on the fact that we have lost the Constitution. We have a police state. We're at war based on lies and deceptions, wars that under the Nuremberg standard that the United States itself set up are war crimes. That these wars serve a very few powerful, organized special interests, and that people are being slaughtered and destroyed in order to serve a few rich special interests. and I think it's just been very frustrating to see the defense of the wars, the defense of the police state, not just by right-wing crazies, but even by progressives, people on the left. And we've seen the federal judiciary essentially abandon civil liberties. They go along with these indefinite detentions, with these fake show trials of alleged terrorists, all of whom are a part of some FBI organized plot people to give up their civil liberties in the Constitution is astounding. And it's especially the case when so many Americans think that when you're defending the Constitution and civil liberties, that you're anti-American and you're on the side of Muslim terrorists. So they can't even perceive what the real threat is. You see, what America is the Constitution. And the attack on the Constitution is coming from the American government, not from terrorists. And so that kind of made me see it's futile. You know, you get letters from the right wing saying, if you hate America so much, why don't you move to Cuba? And you get letters from the left wing saying, we can't believe you worked for Reagan. And then, of course, we have the 9/11 issue. The 9/11 is the reason we have these wars and the police state, and yet it can't be discussed. It can't even be mentioned on sites that are totally opposed to the war in the police state, such as Counterpunch or antiwar.com. And so you've got these sites and all this intellectual energy trying to oppose the police state and oppose the wars, and yet they accept the premise on which those are based. And it's impossible to oppose a war in the police state when you agree with the government's account of 9/11, because that's the basis. And so it makes you realize the whole thing is just sort of futile. And so if you're tired on top of that, and you're repeating yourself, and you realize it's essentially futile because you can't cut through any of the issues, then I think that's why I decided I was really just sort of pissing into the wind, you know.
Well, I think that there are a whole lot of people feeling pretty discouraged, disgusted, futile, hopeless after seeing how we've been lied to by Obama, how we're dealing with a Congress where everybody seems to be working for the corporations and nobody for Main Street. I know I'm having days where I'm wondering, but this, I guess, it's. I'm trying to think. Do you just quit? I mean, you've been at this your whole life, just about, haven't you?
Yeah. I'm 71 years old too, and I decided I wanted a little bit of what might be left of my life for myself.
So how do you do it?
I haven't had the oar in. But look, Rob, you know, you have a good site, and it's very broad. It deals with lots of issues. I've never been censored on your site, even though there is somebody associated with it who claims he's a scientist and he tries to prevent any mention of 9/11 stuff. But I've never.
Yeah, frankly, we have among our senior editors, there's a lot of disagreement about 9/11, and our policy has been to publish new ideas, new angles, new information. But, you know, what we found with 9/11 is there are a lot of people who wake up to 9/11, they watch Loose Change or read a book about it, and then they think that it's a new discovery, and they write an article about the most basic elements of it, and they want us to publish it, even though we've published hundreds, maybe thousands of them.
Yes, that's what I said. I've not been censored there on that site, though I do know that you've got people there who've fallen for the government's line. And that also blows my mind. I can't see how anybody with even a minimal education can believe the government's account.
I don't think, frankly,
unbelievable. It violates every known law of physics that I learned at Georgia Tech. And the prospect that this Sheikh Mohammed is a more powerful superhero than V in the movie V for Vendetta. This guy somehow outwitted all 16 U.S. intelligence agencies, all foreign intelligence agencies, including Mossad, outwitted the National Security Council, the Pentagon, could keep the Air Force from launching interceptor planes, could cause the Pentagon's state-of-the-art air defenses to fail. Could cause airport security to fail 4 times in 1 hour. All these things that are attributed to 9/11 to this guy is beyond fantasy, and yet people believe it. So, if he's this powerful, my God, we should, be courting him. We should do whatever it takes to get him on our side. So the whole thing is, and then they have to waterboard him, you see, 183 times to get some kind of confession, because they've got to close this issue, because it's dynamite for them. It's such a blatantly obvious inside job that they've got to close it down. And so all of a sudden it's not Bin Laden anymore. It's somebody we've never before heard about. And he's now the mastermind, and they're going to close it down. The same way they closed down the anthrax thing by blaming it on the dead guy. So these things, it troubles me to think that Americans watching the films of the towers, for example, that they are unable to perceive that those are buildings blowing up. Those are not buildings falling down. A building falling down looks totally different from a building blowing up. And yet, the government tells them, these buildings are falling down. So they say, the building's falling down. The government says it's falling down. Their own eyes, they can't even see a building blowing up and say, hey, that building's not falling down, it's blowing up. All these things sort of led me to the conclusion, which was the main point of my article. Not that I'm stopping writing. That wasn't the point of my article. My point of the article was that, hey, look, truth has disappeared. It has no one can recognize it. No one respects it. No one demands it. We all know by now that the Bush administration orchestrated these wars, and yet no one's held accountable. We know by now the Bush people knew there were no weapons of mass destruction. Yeah, they said there were, so they could go to war. If they'll orchestrate a war which is kill huge numbers of totally innocent people, why wouldn't they orchestrate 9/11? And then people say, government never killed its own people. Well, but they most certainly do. They killed them at Waco. They killed the Branch Davidians. They had, back in the Kennedy years, they had Operation Northwoods, which called for shooting Americans down the streets in Washington and Miami and blowing up boatloads of Cuban refugees and fabricating airline hijacking and crashes so they could blame Castro and invade the island and have regime change. And this isn't a conspiracy theory. This is an official government document proved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, released to the public by the Warren Commission investigating Kennedy's death. It's available online. It's in the National Security Archives. It's a real document. It showed the United States government was prepared to telephone people in order to blame Castro and invade the island. So why is it we think, they'd never do 9/11? Of course they would. They have an agenda. They want to get on with it. The special interests that control everything. So,
You're talking about also about Israel in this theory, right?
Well, Israel certainly has an agenda, and it's to steal the entirety of Palestine and southern Lebanon. And they've been doing it for years, and nothing stops them. It's worse and worse. If you look at the maps of Palestine over the years that are available, you can see it's just about disappeared. And yet, most Americans think, the poor Israelis, they're totally innocent, peace-loving people, and they're beset by these awful Palestinian terrorists who are always blowing up Israelis. And people have no idea of what's going on. And there are a lot of Israeli peace groups who publish stories and give the true information. It doesn't go anywhere. And Haaretz, the newspaper there, if you read that as I do, it is a powerful critic of the Israeli policy. And if anybody in the United States said anything like what Haaretz says, they'd probably be damned forever as anti-Semite, or they might even be arrested as for a hate crime. It's just hard to see. So, truth is just not available to people, and they can't recognize it when it is. And that's why I said that, truth is dead, and when truth is dead, liberty is dead. And that's the point of my article, not that I'm frustrated and I'm going to break my pen and not write anymore. I just came to the conclusion that the whole effort was futile. Now, I had about 4,000 emails from readers asking me to reconsider. But I'm of the opinion that the die's cast. There's the American and Israeli militarism now going to run their course. There's nothing can be done other than just the collapse of the dollar. I mean, the dollar may simply collapse, in which case American militarism, there will be no way to finance it. And you see, I just saw, I think the last day or two, there was an article by Dave Lindorf. It may have been on your site, I don't know. But he says that 53% of the tax revenues goes to the military. And I think what he means is even worse than that. It's more than half of the federal budget, if you add up all the aspects of the military regime, not just the direct Pentagon budget. More than half of the government's budget is spent on military. And yet, I'll get letters from progressives who say, why you attack the government? It does all these good things for the poor people. You're just against the poor. Well, what does the government do for poor people? The amount of money it spends helping anybody other than the powerful, rich, organized interest is infinitesimal. It doesn't spend anything on them. But it spends $1.6 trillion a year in one way or the other on military activities. And so all these people who run around supporting the government, they're supporting this whole militarist regime.
That's a bipartisan thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Let me do a station ID.
I'm not right, I'm not left, I'm not Democrat, I'm not Republican. I'm sense justice.
Paul, let me do a station ID now. This is the Rob Kall Bottom Up Radio Show, WNJC 1360 AM, sponsored by opednews.com. I've been talking with Paul Craig Roberts, who is thoroughly disgusted, who feels it is futile to keep on writing. Paul?
Yep.
So, we're in times that call for strong voices now more than ever, really, I believe. There are a lot of people who have been co-opted by Obama. I'm excited in some ways by the Tea Party people. I'd like to get your idea on them. I don't like a lot of the things that they say, but when I talk to them face to face, I find that I agree with some of the things that they say. More than I expect generally, and I've done it a couple times, and each time I do it, I find new things. It's interesting. You bring up the problems with the World Trade Organization and NAFTA and CAFTA and globalization, and how that's bad for America and just benefits a handful. I've been saying that. Dennis Kucinich has been saying it. I just don't understand how people who care about American business cannot oppose it. The biggest reason I don't like Bill Clinton is because he signed those bills. And we've got a lot to do now. We are in a place. When I say Obama has co-opted a lot of people keep waiting for him to act like a Democrat. And the more I see him, the more I see him acting like a duopolist. And the more I'm convinced that there really aren't two very different parties. They may have some social issues that are different and disagreement on taxes, but on probably the most important issues, they're functioning the same way. What do you think?
Well, of course. Look, Rob, offshoring destroyed the unions, and that was the financial base of the Democratic Party. And so the Democrats now are dependent on the exact same funding sources as Republicans. They're dependent on the Wall Street investment banks. They're dependent on the military security complex, the insurance companies, the pharmaceuticals, the big agricultural corporations. So they've had to behave exactly the same. They took part in fact, George Wallace back in the 60s, the Alabama governor who was running as an independent for the presidential nomination and doing so well, they had to have him shot. He said back then that there's not a dime's worth of difference between the parties. Now, he was making the point. I think it was a bit of an overstatement for those days because the unions were still there and the Democrats still had an independent financial base from the Republicans, but now they have the same base. There's no difference between them. And, of course, a lot of the black leaders have been co-opted and bought off. And so all of the kind of...
By who?
Huh?
By who?
By the establishment. So the kinds of, they're all part of it now. So the kinds of dynamic factors that were, demanding accountability and change, and they've all been subdued. And you ask about the Tea Party. A lot of people are angry. If you look at it, though, they're all angry they're angry for different reasons. This is not some kind of a uniform movement. There's all kinds of different reasons that they're angry. Many of them are mutually contradictory. And what I think will happen to the Tea Party is that it will be taken over. Probably the Republicans will take it over and use the anger, against Obama, who's a Muslim and black and selling out the country and not a citizen and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of Tea Party people are mad about that. So it's a dangerous situation. I mean, I agree that it shows people are upset, and they should be. But what they're upset about isn't necessarily rooted in any truth or facts. It's a mixture. Some people are upset about what's really happening, and others are upset about all the myths that go around the internet and everything. Obama's a Muslim and that type of thing. So what will come out of it is probably some kind of confusion, something the Republicans will be able to take advantage of. And even today on your site, there's an article by Mark Carlin, and I'm not disputing the reports or anything, but he is down on that part of the Tea Party, which are white Christians who believe the government is oppressive. Well, but the government is oppressive. It is oppressive. Look, tomorrow is tax day, right?
You bet.
April 15th, and what does that remind us of? It reminds us that we do not own our own labor. The government has first claim on our labor. Historically, the definition of a free person is a person who owns his own labor. If you don't own your own labor, you're either a serf or a slave. All Americans have been serfs or slaves since 1913, when the income tax was passed. Now, you try to tell this to a progressive, oh, they hit the wall. Oh, you're for the rich. We have to get the rich. We have to help the poor. Well, you're not doing anything like that. What you're doing is recreating the conditions of feudalism in which people don't own their own labor. The government owns it, or has first claim to it.
You know, Paul, we're going to disagree on this one.
But it's true. It's historically the definition of a free person is a person that owns his own labor. And that's why in the United States Constitution, income tax was illegal.
You know,
And, hey, look, we're not going to recreate feudalism in America.
so would you get rid of all? Would you get rid of all wage taxes?
Yeah.
And what would you replace them with?
Tariffs like it were originally set up. And then that would prevent the offshoring. And we would, again, have strong unions and strong industry and manufacturing, and people would have jobs and prospects, and and the universities would have a future career. As it is now, our universities have no future.
How about inheritance tax? How about capital gains tax?
Well, inheritance tax, it's anything anybody has at the end of their life, they've already paid tax on. So when you say you have inheritance tax, you're simply saying we are confiscating part of your property. And so you don't own your labor, you don't own your property. And now a capital gains tax, this is you have to be an economist really to understand this. There isn't any capital gain. Suppose you bought a house for $50,000, and then 10 years later you sell it for $100,000, and they say, oh, you have a $50,000 capital gain, but you don't, because the replacement cost of the house is $100,000. You don't have any gain.
Well, but there are special.
The house, pay the tax. You can't replace the house.
But that's not fair, because the selling your own house, there are tax breaks for that. Let's talk about investment.
That's something they put in because it finally dawned on them that there was no gain there, and you couldn't replace the house you lived in after taxes.
So
true stocks. If you buy a stock and it goes up, what it's reflecting when the stock price goes up, or what it used to be before all the manipulation from the hedge funds, now it's just some kind of a rigged casino. But what it used to be, if the price of a stock went up, it meant the earnings went up, and so the government was collecting income tax on the earnings and collecting it again if the earnings were paid in dividends and interest.
Okay, so Paul, I don't get it. How does a county pay for county government, county road services, for schools, for local police? How does the state pay for those, for state roads? How does the judicial system get paid for? How if you don't have taxes?
The same way they paid for them prior to 1913. I mean, we didn't just get roads and school systems in 1913. You know.
Well, actually, the roads before 1913 were for primarily for horses. So the road system that we have, that is the best one in the world, was built with taxes.
On gasoline.
Well, but you know, okay.
Built with income taxes.
All right, so but you know what I'm trying to ask you is, where do you get the money if you don't charge income taxes, you don't charge inheritance tax, and you don't charge capital gains tax? What?
Well, Rob, income taxes and capital gains taxes are not the source of revenues that build roads and schools. The schools based on the property tax, and the roads, at least originally, and used to be, and I think they still are, though I'm not sure, were based on the gasoline tax. So, you know, the income tax, that supports the military. So, you know, look.
It also supports Medicare and Social Security.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
Well, I'm talking about all the taxes on income.
Well, it's the Social Security and Medicare tax.
But they're income taxes. They're taxes on income. I mean, you're talking strictly about the Internal Revenue Service tax.
Yeah.
And you're talking about state income taxes and city wage taxes.
So look, Rob, I'm not talking about anything other than reporting that the traditional definition of a free person is and has always been recognized by liberals as a person who owns his own labor. And this is what was new. This was the transition that Marx made so much about, from feudalism to free labor. Free labor was free because it did not have any obligations to government. There was no longer a tax on labor. Now, under feudalism, the tax was paid in kind. It was paid in terms of you had to work a third of your time for the feudal lord, and then you could work 2/3 of your time for yourself. And slavery, the slave essentially had to work half the time for his master or his owner, because the other half of his time is what it took to maintain his own life. And in fact, there were examples in American slavery of slaves who were productive in skills and arts and crafts being released from their owners to towns where they were paid half of their wages and the other half was remitted to the owner on the plantation. And that's what we have. That's what the federal income tax does. The employer withholds part of your earnings from you and gives them to the government. Now, what we're seeing in this discussion is all the emotions over the years that are tied up with an income tax. And these have now become more important than people being free and owning their own labor. And that's what we're seeing in this discussion. And it's the same sort of thing that I was talking about earlier, about civil liberties. Oh, we don't need those if the terrorists are going to get us. And the Constitution always in the way of the government protecting us. And how can we hold our president accountable? Or you listen to Billy Crystal, for example. Well, I don't understand how you can be patriotic if you don't support the government. Anybody that doesn't support the government obviously is not patriotic. In other words, what's the Constitution? It doesn't. The government can violate the Constitution, but we have to support the government. Otherwise,
but Paul,
patriotic. All of these kinds of mistakes are everywhere. They're just everywhere. And you see what I'm saying? Now, I'm not. I don't want to say, oh, we have to abolish everything. I'm just making a point that historically, a free person owned his own labor.
Paul, if you take this, what you're saying, you could say that if somebody has to pay rent or pay a mortgage on a property, then the money that they're putting out for that, especially say rent, that is their labor, and that you could call them a serf because they're paying rent.
No, absolutely not, because that's their voluntary choice. If they wanted to rent a place, look, it's nothing about how people allocate their income, as long as it's their choice. But you try not giving the government the income it claims. First of all, you can't do it because it's withheld at the source. So you really can't even cheat on your taxes, most people, because you never see the money anyhow. It just goes directly to the government.
Well,
you have no choice about it, and if the few people
actually, Paul,
cheat on the government, they put you in prison. It's just like the feudal lords, just like the robber barons. Throw him in the dungeon. He pays taxes.
But you're suggesting that people can choose not to rent. So what do? Live on the street?
No, Rob, look. You're conflating the claim of somebody else to a share of your income with you spending your income that you earned. You could say the same thing about your grocery bill. Oh, what choice do you have but to buy food? Otherwise, you die.
Well, look, where we agree is that the military is a part of government that is totally out of control, and that both parties have unleashed it and are afraid to stand up to it. And I really believe that the American military could be the most dangerous threat to American democracy that we face. That and corporate excesses. But, people need roads. They need police. They need schools and those things.
They need police. The police abuse the hell out of them.
Well, we do have problems with the police, that's for sure.
Abusing the public.
So,
and they've been militarized. And now the function of the police is to control the public.
I'm not going to argue with that one.
The police are not on your side.
I'm not going to argue with that one.
Look at YouTube. There's several 100,000 videos of the police brutalizing people who haven't done anything. Look, this belief in government is the great Achilles heel of the progressive movement. I certainly agree that I'd rather have the government helping the poor than funding wars. We're on the same side about that. But look, why did the government decide to go to wars rather than to help people? Now that tells you all you need to know about government. So to have faith in government after everything you see and witness and write about, everything that's on your site, the fact that you've got faith in government is sort of mind-blowing. It's an organized criminal gang. It has power that nobody else has, not even the biggest corporations. It does what it wants. And yes, the military is a threat, but the biggest threat, in my opinion, is the fact that the Constitution is not defended. The federal judges don't defend it. The Supreme Court doesn't defend it.
What aspect?
No aspect. Well, what's been done about torture under United States statutory law is illegal. Torture is illegal under the Geneva Conventions. It's a war crime. Nothing has been done about it. Habeas corpus is a constitutional right. Due process. Nothing has been done. All these things have been destroyed. The courts have done nothing. People have been, we now have the report, I'm sure you saw it, and it's probably on your site, that the Bush administration knew that those people they held in Guantanamo were innocent. Yet they held them and tortured them for years. And nothing has been done about it. There's no accountability. Nothing. The law schools aren't up in arms. bar associations, and the federal judges go along with it. They preside over these trumped-up false cases where, as I said earlier in this conversation, some federal agent goes and rounds up a gang and does all the talking and then arrests them.
Let's get back to government. Let's get back to government. What do we do about it? What is your solution? Do you have one? Do you have any ideas on how to fix the problem?
Before the Bush administration, before 9/11, I wrote a book on how the law was lost, because we had already lost it just from prosecutorial abuse, and because various single interest groups were determined to chase after their specific devil. We had to get the drug lords, we had to get the child abusers, and in order to get all those people, they decided to get rid of all the legal protections. So we had already essentially lost.
What's the name of the book?
It's called The Tyranny of Good Intentions. I called it How the Law Was Lost, and the publisher called it The Tyranny of Good Intentions. But what it shows is how each of the constitutional protections of the individual, what Blackstone said was, law is a shield of the people, not a weapon in the hands of the state. And each part of the shield has been turned into a weapon. So we showed this happened before 9/11. Now, to get to the answer to your question, I said the only solution is a rebirth in respect and veneration for the Constitution. Instead of venerating presidents, governments, and political figures, we have to go back to what the Founding Fathers told us. You venerate the Constitution. And a government, even your own, that goes against the Constitution is your worst enemy. The worst enemy you'll ever have.
Now, this is what Glenn Beck has been saying.
Well, even an idiot can say something true occasionally. But it's not what Glenn Beck said, it's what Thomas Jefferson said, and George Washington, and all the rest of them, and Madison. And it's our whole heritage that we are the Constitution. That's what America is. It's not a race. It's not an ethnic group. It's not an ideological group. It's the Constitution that makes government accountable to people and denies government powers to oppress the people. That's what the Constitution is. Now, it's been shredded in my lifetime. And so the only thing that can save us is to restore a veneration and respect for the Constitution. But you don't see that. You don't see it in the law schools. It's certainly not true among federal prosecutors. They're always running roughshod over it. They withhold exculpatory evidence. They pay witnesses for false testimony. I mean, you may not be aware that over 95% of felonies are settled by coerced plea bargains. And people never get a jury trial.
Wow. How many? What percent?
95 to 96%. And as a consequence, since they never get a jury trial, the police investigations don't take place because the police know there's no chance in hell of any of their cases, of any of their evidence being tested in court. So what happens is, like an accusation is made. Years ago, prosecutors would look at both sides of the story and say, okay, here's a police case. It says this person did this, and this is the evidence on the person's side. Now, what do I think of this? Is this worth prosecuting or not? And a lot of times, prosecutors will say, well, this case, I don't believe it, or it's not worth prosecuting. But now, what happens? The police make a charge. The prosecutor simply accepts it as a way to give another because the defendant's lawyer knows that he can't possibly go to court. Because if he tries to go to court, the prosecutor then says, oh, well, you know, it's not just this charge. There's also X, Y, Z, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is how they busted Michael Milken. They kept upping the number of charges.
Yeah, well, that's what the way the law is set up. There are so many ill-defined, unclear laws that they can just get you if they want to, and they use it to do what you've described, to force you to settle, to plead guilty, or they can just literally throw the book at you.
Right. They can keep throwing charges until you give up. And then you say, well, okay, make a deal. And then what you do, you make up an offense that didn't even happen. And you admit to some defense that didn't even occur. And then the prosecutor gets his conviction and you get a lighter sentence than if you had gone to trial. So that's the way the system works. So the evidence doesn't play a part in it. And this is another example of the death of truth, because it used to be that the function of a trial was to find the truth. Justice depended on finding the truth, and that's what the trial did. Well, of course, there aren't trials anymore, or very few of them. And so the truth is never found. Instead, the defendant is forced to admit to some crime that never occurred in order to avoid the trauma of going to court on multiple charges of things that he couldn't possibly, at some point the jury might throw out 90% of the charges. But the ones that are left, if you go to trial, you get a much more severe penalty than if you make a deal.
That happened to a colleague of mine. He was charged with 130-some counts. And it took 2 years, but every single one of them were eventually dropped because he fought it. But how many people fight that?
Yeah, but how many? I mean, he was lucky. How many fight and win?
Yeah.
Practically none.
Well, that reminds me, we still have Bush-appointed, Rove-coached federal prosecutors in the Department of Justice that Eric Holder is keeping at work, that Obama is keeping at work. And, I got to know Cyril Wecht a bit. He's the medical examiner for Pittsburgh, and they went after him, cost him millions of dollars to defend himself. They basically accused him of using a fax machine for personal uses, something like $15 worth of faxing. Unbelievably ridiculous charges. He got off after going, mortgaging his house and what have you to deal with it. But Don Siegelman down in Alabama, he's not off. There, he was accused of doing something that previous governors did, and governors since then have done exactly the same thing. And
he was framed up. I wrote about that case, as did a number of people. He was completely framed up and railroaded. There's no doubt about it. In fact, the judges and the prosecutors conspired to frame him and railroad him.
Yes.
And now these are Justice Department. These are not Alabama.
No, these are federal
judges. These are federal, presidentially appointed
criminals.
Prosecutors, federal judges, and they did it. So this is what I was saying earlier. You see what I'm saying? There's no respect in any institution of the government for truth, for justice. There's none.
Well, we got to keep fighting.
Well,
I want to read you something. Give me a moment to read this. I'm just going to do a station ID. This is the Rob Kall Bottom Up Radio Show, WNJC 1360 AM. I'm going to call this guy Pete for now, and I'll tell you his real name later. Pete was of these the most powerful. He was a well-bred man of a gentle and insinuating behavior, ready to help and assist the poor, whose cause he pretended to espouse. He was wise and moderate to his enemies, a most artful and accomplished dissembler. and he was every way virtuous except in his inordinate ambition. His ambition gave him the appearance of possessing qualities which he really wanted. He seemed the most zealous champion for equality among the citizens, while he was actually aiming at the entire subversion of freedom. And he declared loudly against all innovations while he was actually meditating a change. The giddy multitude, caught by these appearances, were zealous in seconding his views, and without examining his motives were driving headlong to tyranny and destruction. What I'm reading from is the history of Greece. It wasn't Pete, it was Pisistratus. And, this is a history of, I dug up, I found a copy of, not a copy, an original book on the history of Greece, printed around 1771, that Jefferson read. And he wrote about it in letters. And this book describes how greedy individuals literally worked to destroy democracy. And we know now that they were successful. So, you talk about how what we need to do is defend and respect and venerate the Constitution as a way to deal with government. We need more details, Paul. What else do we need to do? How do we do it?
It would take, I think it would have to come from the law schools. The law schools would have to change the way they train the legal profession, and they would have to bring it back to the Constitution so that people would be imbued with respect and all of the Constitution, and it would form the basis of their professional practice. That then would make it difficult for corrupt prosecutors and corrupt federal judges, because there would be outcries and there would be legal maneuverings against them, and it would gradually spread wider into the education system, and it would come back to what we used to have when we had an independent people aware of the Constitution, aware of their rights, very jealous to defend their rights, and realize that they have to also defend the rights of others, because if the rights can be taken away from one man, they can be taken away from all. And that's
Amen.
The way it used to be here, but that's been lost from a variety of ways, some of which we mentioned earlier.
That's a long-term plan. Is there anything that we can do in a shorter term that people listening to this radio show can do?
Recently in one of the stands in Central Asia, I forget which one it was, there was a revolution that threw the government out.
Was that Kazakhstan?
If they could do it, and it was a very oppressive government, and it had military that was shooting people down the street, and nevertheless, the people persisted and threw it out. So, if it wasn't some kind of CIA organized coup, then the only other thing I can think of is revolution. And of course,
Does that make you a terrorist?
well, you ask what could be done, and I just answered the question. I didn't advocate it, so I don't know if it makes me a terrorist or not. But of course, it would make Thomas Jefferson one. But of course, the Bolsheviks were all arrested and tortured and given a show trial by Stalin. So I think that if we had an early Stalin in our career, he would have arrested Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. So it's just hard to know.
Well, we did. Didn't we? Didn't Adams try to, what was that term for,
No, he had was it the Alien and Sedition?
He was arresting people for sedition if they complained.
Well, he wanted to. I don't know how far he got. They did get that overturned. But you see, today we have that back. They don't call noticed recently the head of Homeland Security said the threat now is Americans. We're now focused on the domestic terrorist threat, Americans. And they arrested some blonde, blue-eyed woman, remember?
Yes.
So they're already moving. See, first you start off with somebody that's easy to demonize. It's different. So, okay, it's the Muslims. Dark-skinned Muslims, they blew up the World Trade Center. Everybody gets down on them, so we can take away all their rights. But once you do that, then you can start on the others. And they have now. As I said, they've now got a blonde, blue-eyed female domestic American terrorist. And so, yeah, I mean, you and I may be next, Rob. You take it for you assume you have the right to have your site, radio show, make protests, but at some point the government will decide that you don't have that right.
And I got a guy calling for revolution. Jeez.
Well, as I said, you asked what could be done, and I said that the only thing other than the long-term approach of restoring respect and authority of the Constitution would be what the people in Kyrgyzstan, or wherever it was, a week or so ago, and they stood the government out. And not through votes, because what we've learned here is votes don't change anything. I mean, what did Obama change?
So in Oklahoma, they're saying they want to create a state militia to defend the Constitution. What do you think of that?
Well, that's their right. That's the absolute, total right. They have the right to do that. Now, my own view is that the founding fathers, of course, relied on the Second Amendment so that people could defend themselves against the government. But that's from the days when the weapons in the hands of the citizenry and the weapons in the hands of the government's army were the same. Of course, today, no citizen is permitted to have anything like the weapons the military has. And so, even though people have guns, they are essentially unarmed. They wouldn't have any. The militia would have no ability to withstand an assault from the federal government. It doesn't have any. There's no way it can have anything like the weapons. So, or the communications and the spy photos. And so, today, people, no matter how many guns they have, they may be protected against other individuals or bands of ruffians and gangs, but they're not have any way to protect themselves from the federal military force. So, the prospect of revolution is certainly diminished given, the success of it, given the disparity in the armaments between the state and the people.
Well, if we look at other nations, and I'm not advocating for this, but I'm just looking and discussing it, they don't do it with one group of people facing off against another. They use asymmetric warfare. They use explosions. They use suicide bombers. That's the way the revolutions are being fought all over the world, it seems. They're called terrorists, but they are also revolutionaries.
Well, I think you can resist an occupation in that way the Palestinians resist the Israeli occupation, or the way Hezbollah resisted the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, and the way the Iraqis resisted the American occupation of Iraq. But I don't know how that would work against your own government, where there's no foreign occupation. It's just you're all the same entity. And of course, too, it depends on the barbarity of the government. Some governments would be willing simply to Wolfowitz or Billy Crystal saying, oh, we mustn't kill everybody in Seattle because they're resisting us, they probably would say, yes, kill them all.
Now, you keep saying Billy Crystal. There's an entertainer by that name. You mean William Crystal, who's a publisher, right?
I mean the neocon son of Irving Crystal.
Right, yeah.
The Weekly Standard guy. And,
Yeah.
He's the one who said, what's the use of nuclear weapons if you can't use them? And
It's insanity.
And we have it Cass Sunstein. He was an Obama appointed, a Harvard law professor appointed to the Obama administration, who said, hey, look, we have to infiltrate the 9/11 truth movement with federal agents so that we can get them involved in things that we can arrest them for. So there you have it. I mean, here's a Harvard law professor, an Obama appointee. He wants to infiltrate the 9/11 truth movement with federal agents and frame them up and arrest them. So, what basis is there for confidence in government? The minute people with power don't respect that there are constraints on that power and don't respect truth as an independent force that's above their personal agendas, then the situation is lost. And that's another reason that I came to the conclusion that it's futile, because I think the situation is lost. I don't think the people in the government have any respect for the people, for truth, for justice. They clearly have no mercy.
So what are you going to do, Paul?
You still there?
Yeah, what are you going to do?
What am I going to do? I'm just going to try to take it easy, calm down. I'm going to do a little bit of reading of things I didn't ever get to read. I've got some wonderful pets I'm going to enjoy. I'm going to enjoy my family. I'm going to enjoy the places that I've taken refuge in. They're pretty, and there's lots of natural scenery. And let things play out. I think the course is set. I don't see how we're going to stop anything. They're going to attack Iran. It's just a matter of time. You can tell they are, because they keep telling blatant lies. They keep issuing the same threats. It's just a replay of Iraq. I think our real hope, if we have a hope, and I think everybody needs to have some hope, and I think the hope that we have will come from the fact that that the government in Washington has so abused the dollar as reserve currency that it may lose that role. And if it loses that role, or if the Chinese decide to take it away from us, which I think they could do simply by dumping all their holdings, then the power of the United States simply evaporates overnight. It can't finance itself. It wouldn't even be able to bring the troops home. It wouldn't be able to pay for its imports. There'd be no oil. The United States would go from superpower to fourth world backorder in 10 minutes. And that's what the fools in Washington are capable of doing. The deficits are huge. They cannot be financed by world saving. At some point, they're going to print money. The minute they print money, the confidence in the dollar's reserve currency will disappear. We won't be able to import. We won't be able to finance the federal government. And that will end the wars. Now, it'll put the American people through the mill. I mean, they'll certainly be wrung out. But it'll stop the evil empire in its tracks. And that may be what actually happens, because the government is 20% unemployment, declining economy, and what is there left for them to steal? So I think that the dollar may cause a revolution. The failure of the dollar as reserve currency may cause a revolution, may end up in the destruction of both parties, which, as you said earlier, is really just one party, and with which I agree. And could possibly, the dire nature of the crisis, be far more of a crisis than anything anybody's ever imagined, could produce leadership that would bring the country back gradually into the realm of a civilized nation with respect to human rights and the rights of other people. And right now it doesn't have any respect for anybody's rights.
All right, I have a couple of questions that I ask my guests. I'm going to talk to you about. This is the Rob Kall Bottom Up Radio Show, WNJC 1360 AM. You can listen to the podcasts that we do at opednews.com/podcasts with an S on the end. A couple questions, Paul. One, I'm always asking my guests about how we are transitioning from a top-down culture and world to a bottom-up one, where even the brains work differently. People under 30 have different brains because they've been marinated in the internet and text messages and a whole different way of experiencing the world than people over 30. It's been said that Hillary lost using a top-down campaign against Obama's bottom-up campaign, although there's argument that his campaign was not that bottom-up. Do you have any take on this revolution, this change that we're going through from top-down to bottom-up?
Well, I don't believe it. I think that Americans are more brainwashed than ever. And I don't see a whole lot of indication that the young are less brainwashed. What I do see, though, is that the consequence of all the violent video games is that the young aren't shocked by killings and mass murders and slaughters because they've been doing it all their life on their video screen. And I think it's made it more acceptable because it's not so unusual. I can remember when I was a kid growing up, we'd go up to the Saturday cowboy movies, and no one was ever killed. The good guy always shot the gun out of the hand of the bad guy, knocked him out on the right to the jaw, tied him up, put him over the horse, and took him to the sheriff. And I can remember how shocked we were the first time we saw a movie when the good guy actually shot the outlaw and killed him. Everybody was shocked. But of course, today, by the time somebody's 7 or 8, he's probably already killed 1 million people on violent video games. And not only that, in a lot of these games, you can kill the people and they come back to life. So killing them doesn't really matter because they come right back. And so I think all this affects the mentality. I think it's one reason people aren't shocked that, according to what seems to be substantiated reports, the United States is responsible for 1 million deaths in Iraq. And obviously these were not soldiers or insurgents, and no one seems to mind. They're not shocked. Hey, why do we kill all those people?
Yeah, but Paul, when you establish a policy that children 8 years old have access to video games where they kill, and those games are distributed throughout the population, that's a bottom-up way of changing the way adults think.
Right.
When you create a new media, because video games are now more popular and a bigger business than movies,
Right.
When you create that, and then you establish the rules, which include killing is okay for little children to do in games, then you are immersing those children's minds and spirits and hearts and emotions with murder.
I think that's right, Rob, and I think that's what we saw recently in the video that was leaked by WikiLeaks or whatever it's called, of our troops getting their jollies, killing obvious civilians and reporters.
You know, I interviewed on Friday one of the members of the Bravo company that the WikiLeaks video was about. He was not there on the ground because a couple days before he had refused to fire just randomly at the public, and they didn't trust him anymore.
Right.
His take is that what happened in that video is what was supposed to happen, that the troops are doing what they've been taught to do, and even their mindset, the laughter, the casual way they approach it is part of the plan of the way that the military coaches them. When they're in training, they literally sing songs about killing mothers and children.
Right.
And so
that's exactly it. And I think that has all been aided and abetted by the violent video games. Now, those are the kids that grew up on those violent video games. And so now they get their jollies murdering people. And what they're doing under the Nuremberg standard is a war crime. In fact, it's really worse than what the Nazi SS did. It's really worse.
how's that?
Well, the Nazi SS didn't. They did it as a sort of a duty, but it wasn't. Oh boy, look, this is fun. Let's kill some more.
Yeah,
Anything like that.
it is horrible.
It's horrible, and you're right. That is a good example of from the bottom up revolution in people's attitudes, and it is now working for the neoconservatives and their war for American hegemony over the world. And I think it's going to lead into a nuclear war unless the dollar collapses before we can antagonize Russia and China so much that they actually stand up to us and there's some kind of a showdown. Unless the dollar collapses first, there's going to be a nuclear war that comes out of this indifferent attitude toward human life that now characterizes the United States military, the police, the local police. They all have the same attitude. So it's a very serious situation, and I think the only reason it hasn't broken apart already and that we're not more brutalized than we are is there's still a few semblances of the old system in place, but something's going to crack them one day.
What do you mean a few semblances of the old system?
Well, there are still some older people who have an idea of what the police are supposed to be and do. There's still some restraints from the past that the police may no longer believe, but they haven't actually been overthrown. Those restraints haven't been overthrown. Though increasingly they are overthrown by practice when they break in people's homes without warrants and brutalize them and shoot the family dogs, and it's all, but still there's some outcry about it.
Yeah.
So it's sort of arrested for a little bit, and then it happens again, and then but it's not at the point where it can just happen everywhere without outcry. So, but it'll get there. So those are the kind of things that kind of hold things. Though I think they're very weak. And I recently went with a friend to his gun club. He had some very old lever action Winchesters. They're beautiful things, and he was going to let me shoot them because it's the kind of cowboys had, the cowboy movies I grew up in. And I went there. It's a really nice facility. They have all kinds of safety rules and requirements, and also the police are allowed to use the range. because otherwise they think the police will harass them as they go to and from the club and stop them and question them about the gun. So the police get to use the ranges, and the police were out in force. There were about 40, 50 of them with automatic weapons in some kind of a action course, concentrating fire. It sounded like a war. And this was a police force from a very small, rich, entirely white community. I think the average income in the community is like $300,000 or $400,000. And there are no blacks in the community, no Hispanics, no gangs, no criminals, and yet this police force was essentially a paramilitary force, practicing mass concentrated fire that had no police purpose. And so they're totally militarized. They're prepared to suppress their own population.
Did you see them in Pittsburgh at the that world, what was it? I forget what it's called. There was a big summit meeting there, an economic meeting.
Yeah, that's where they used the noise machines.
Yes.
They attacked crowds that weren't doing anything. They went on the campus to attack the students who weren't doing anything. In other words, there were no protesters, so they had to go use their force against people who weren't even protesting. Yeah, I saw. You covered that on your site, I think.
Yes.
And these are things that should make progressives think about the power of government and how it's been unleashed. It's totally unleashed, and it's going to apply to them as well, and it's going to apply to the right wing as well. It's not, when people use power, they don't exclude anybody. It just falls on whoever. And you look at all this torture stuff. It turns out there have been numerous reports that the Americans doing the torturing were getting their jollies. They were enjoying it. They're having a great time abusing fellow humans who'd done nothing. But they were having a great time. It was fun. It's like, little boys torturing animals and tying tin cans on the tails of dogs and cats and doing all the terrible things that some cruel people do to animals. And that's what was happening with American troops and CIA and psychologists were doing to Muslim captives.
Well, the hopeful...
Muslim captives were people who were sold to the Americans by warlords.
The hopeful thing is there are people like Josh Steiber, the fellow I interviewed on Friday, who stood up and refused to do it and ultimately applied for conscientious objector status and got it.
Yep. But Rob, yes, I know there are always some good people. I'm not saying there are not any good people. There are, but they're helpless. And very few people will do what he did because, first of all, they'd be scared of what's going to happen to them, and second, they don't want to be rejected by their peers. Those people are part of the whatever's going on. See, it used to be, and parents used to know that. Parents would know how easy a kid could get in trouble because he didn't want to go against his peers. So if his peers were doing something bad, he would do it too, and then they'd all get in trouble. And parents used to warn kids about that. They warn them. So the minute you see something, run, get out of there, leave. Don't be part of it. I don't know that this message gets made anymore. And I think on the whole that there won't be many people who will object.
I agree, unfortunately. So another question for you. Yesterday I wrote a piece suggesting that it might be productive to try to find common ground between progressives and Tea Partiers. That since we're both dealing with a duopoly, two parties that are really not addressing our interests or needs, there might be some way to come together. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I'm all in favor of trying, but like I said earlier, I think the Tea Party is a diffuse force. It's not people reacting to the same things. It's a whole bunch of people angry about different things.
Right.
And I think that they will be exploited by the powers that be. I think, Kall Rove, the Republican Party, will probably have a better chance of taking them over than anybody else. And the frustrations that most people have are blind. They don't really know the cause of it. Or they think the cause is something that it's not. They think, oh, well, Obama's a Muslim and he's working against me. Or they've got some crazy idea like that, you see. So they don't, even though they're frustrated and they are upset and prone to action, they don't know why they are or what to do. And so somebody comes and gives them an explanation. They say, oh, yeah, okay, and now off they go. So it will be whoever gives them the best explanation that appeals to the emotions, not to their reason or facts, because they're too ignorant to know how to judge a fact, or they lack the information to see cause and effect. And so it'll be emotional responses. And, of course, that's unpredictable and it's dangerous. And so I don't know what will come out of it. I think it's certainly progressives should try to make these people aware of what the situation really is and how they need to band together. But I'm not even sure the progressives have a good take on it, as we discussed in this conversation. And I'm not sure who has a good take on it. I mean, you obviously have some take on it. I mean, you have a good site that gives information. But not, it's not like we have a group of people who have got it all figured out. That's just not there. And I for years thought that, I could help people figure it out. We could get a group. But I kind of gave up on that. I don't think you can. I remember, for 15, 16 years, I was Business Week's first outside columnist. And I was able to hold on to that despite opposition in the magazine because I was bipartisan in my attacks. I went after George Herbert Walker Bush as strongly as I did Clinton and so on. But my last column, I said that, and I had already detected this, and this was a decade or more ago. I said that reason was failing, and that emotion and emotional responses were replacing reason as a basis for decision making. And I think in the decade or so since I wrote that, that's even more the case now. It's even more the case that emotional responses are replacing reason, analytical-based responses. So that's another reason it's difficult. So whoever can organize the blind emotions of the dissatisfied population they will prevail. And I don't know who that'll be.
Well, that's an interesting question. Who's better at harnessing blind emotions? Somehow I get the feeling it's not usually the good guys.
Right. Because the good guys, to the extent there are any, they're truth motivated.
All right. We're going to wind this down, but I got three last questions I got to ask you. One, what's your take on the health reform legislation that went through Congress, which I call the health insurance gift legislation.
Well, Rob, as you may know, I wrote about it, the original bill and proposal that you had on your site, and I did not follow it after that. I don't know what they did to it or if they changed it at all, but the original bill was clearly written by the insurance companies to create 30 million new clients for themselves at the expense of Medicare and the existing insured people. And that's what the bill was. Now, whether it in any way was altered or changed, I don't know, because after I looked at it and wrote that, I was busy with other things and I never went back to it. So I don't know what the final result was. Usually it's not much different. And it's very difficult to pass a bill that's against the interests of the powerful lobby group that it affects. So I imagine it's still something that creates advantages for private insurance companies at the expense of Medicare and the existing insured, but I don't know.
Okay. Wrapping down, another question. Who are your heroes, living heroes, people that you respect as heroes?
I think John Pilger. I think Harvey Silverglade.
Silverglade?
Glade, G-L-A-T-E.
Who was he?
He was the head of the Massachusetts ACLU. He's a noted defense attorney. He recently wrote a book exposing the total corruption of the United States Department of Justice, simply a gang of organized criminals. I think Bill Anderson, William Anderson. He's an economics professor at some small college in Maryland who has taken on cases of wrongful prosecution and exposed them. He was instrumental in exposing the wrongful prosecution in the Duke lacrosse case, where the black stripper claimed she was raped and the guys were being railroaded by a totally corrupt prosecutor, Nifong, his name, and Anderson's investigations and exposés ended in Nifong being disbarred as a common criminal, which is what he was. And he's currently writing about the attempted frame-up of another woman on a false child abuse charge, which is a payback from an enemy of long ago who's brought false charges in. He's exposing that, and I think that this takes a tremendous amount of heroism and determination and fortitude, because I myself have written about a number of these wrongful prosecution cases. And it just really drains you when you see the brutality of prosecutors and judges against people they know are totally innocent, and yet they're determined to destroy them. And I just found that one of those draining things I ever did, was covering those cases. And now Bill Anderson does a fantastic job. He defends the wrongfully accused. Now, obviously, you can't defend them all. I mean, there's an endless number of them. And I'm sure I've got other heroes. If you asked me this in advance and I could sit down and think, I probably would come up with others. But there are three people right there.
Who's John Pilger? Could you describe a little bit about who he is and why he's a hero for you?
Well, John Pilger is the famous English documentary filmmaker. I think actually he's Australian, but he lives in England and has had his career there. And his documentaries are just absolutely devastating in exposing just the evil machinations of the United States government, the British government. He's a left-wing person, I guess, a member of the real left, the old left, that seems to have disappeared. And the places he will go and the risk he will take in order to get the story on film is just amazing. I'm surprised he's still alive. But he is certainly a heroic person. I mean, we have one of our own. What's his name there? Michael Moore. But Pilger is just, I'm not taking away anything from Michael Moore, but Pilger is in a class of his own. And to see his documentaries, to read his columns. In fact, you should get his columns on your site. I mean, they're every bit. They're stronger than mine. They're really good. And the guy has a sense of justice, and you read it, you can see the sense of justice and the outrage and the humanity of the man. It's anybody who can go through what we're going through without a sense of outrage just hasn't any humanity.
I got to write that down. Just hasn't any humanity.
Yeah, anybody going through what we're going through.
Without a sense of outrage,
has no humanity.
So, I have one last question. It's an experiment. It's a new project I'm working on. You're the first person I'm asking this, and it comes out of the blue. I don't know if you're going to have an answer or not, but I've started a new website that has nothing but a picture and a headline on it right now. I'm working on putting it together. It's called smallacts.org. And my theory, there are actually a couple quotes that I have that are supporting it, that have been cited by Howard Zinn, and I can't even think of the other guy. But here it is. I think this is it. Yeah, so here are the quotes, just to kind of prime the pump. Small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can transform the world. That's Howard Zinn. And Pete Seeger said, I honestly believe the future is going to be millions of little things saving us. And I believe that every day among the billions of people on this planet, billions of small acts are done that make a difference. And I want to collect some of the significant ones that have made a difference. I'm convinced that it doesn't have to be an act of Congress to change the world. Sometimes it can be a decision to say no, or to take a small risk, or to engage in an act of kindness, and that can reverberate across the planet. You have any thoughts about that?
I think it's an excellent idea. It's certainly, you should certainly pursue it. And you see, one advantage of it, or has many, one advantage is it gets people away from these causes, these mass causes that relies on government power to coerce somebody. And it brings it back to individual acts of humanity. I think one of our downfalls for all of these causes, these mass causes, the war on drugs, the Child Protection Act, there have been so many innocent victims of that. All these kinds of mass movements which rely on government government power and coercion. That's what has helped unleash it. So to come back to individual acts of humanity, and of course there is a hope there, and it's a long-term hope. But you know, Rob, let me say one other thing in behalf of your new project. My professor at Oxford was Michael Polanyi. He was a famous scientist and also
What was his name?
Michael Polanyi, Polanyi.
Oh, yes.
And what Polanyi said early on, he told me, he said, look, all of this concern with the Soviet Union is behind the times. It's overblown. And he's talking, he's telling me this in the 60s, in the 70s. He said, this system is already gone. The symbols of it are still there in place, but it disappeared with Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalin, because that broke the mystique of the powered party as infallible. And ever since then, he said, the belief among the top party leaders in communism was dying. And that former communist intellectuals that he personally knew had written in journals things such as, the party told us that the sea was lemonade and we drank it until we vomited. And he said the Soviet Union collapsed because the belief in it collapsed among the leaders. That it died, it wasn't overthrown or it died because the people who benefited most from it ceased to believe in it. So that type of thing, that type of an explanation claims that even brutal people with unlimited power can still come back to a reasonable, moral approach to things. And so I think that's a very supportive idea for your project, and it really also sort of mitigates the kind of pessimism you heard from me today, because it says that even evil people at some point can have enough. And the Polanyi started with Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956 denouncing Stalin. And he said the reason that Khrushchev did that is because the entire top echelons of the party had come to realize that they were all vulnerable under the way that system worked. No one was safe except the top leader, and maybe not even the top leader, because all the others would feel they weren't safe because of him and plot against him. And so he said that Khrushchev had to denounce the Stalinist system. And that once they did that, the whole belief in the infallibility of the Communist Party evaporated. And of course, it took its time to work through, but if you look at Reagan's approach to Gorbachev, he did not approach it from a neoconservative standpoint of smiting them and knocking them down. He said, we're going to end the Cold War. We're not going to win it, we're going to end it. And he was able to appeal to Gorbachev in terms of goodwill. And they resolved this on the basis of mutual goodwill. And then, of course, once the system collapsed, then the bastards in Washington started taking advantage of the Russians and renewed the Cold War and did everything that we promised we would not do. We brought Eastern Europe into NATO. We are now trying to put missile bases on the Russian borders. We did everything that Reagan said would never be done. And so we now see the United States behaving as the evil
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a theory that the U.S. prefers not to capture bin Laden because he's worth more as an excuse while he's free, or where his being alive or dead is not known.
Right.
Paul, we've been going and going here. This has been great. You've talked about a few things that I think would be great articles. The collapse of the dollar and its potential for changing things in a good way is a very interesting piece. If I might encourage you to think about writing at a different place, in a different way. You've been very courageous in what you've done and said so far. I hope we see you back again.
Well, Rob, I appreciate the support. I appreciate the forums you gave me, and I appreciate your efforts. And as you're a much younger man, you may have more energy to continue with them. And I'm not going to say that I'll never participate again. I'm going to do a few radio things from time to time, but I'm just going to watch now and see what happens. I'm going to see how things play, and if I get back enough faith and the power of truth to be resurrected, then I might come back. I might come back later and try to say something. On the other hand, it may be others now will take over and carry this on. Sometimes the baton has to pass, or whatever it is they call it, and other people come into the fray. But we have you there, and you certainly do good. And of course, if somehow 9/11 could be exposed, if people could simply realize what they're looking at when they see the buildings, then possibly we could hold an evil government accountable, and the shock of it would lead to the restoration of the power of the Constitution. And I think we would see a lot of judges would be forced to stand down. We would get people in who are determined to avoid inhumane means in order to achieve some goal favored by powerful special interest. But that's the way the system works now. And of course 9/11 enabled that more than anything. And the myth about 9/11 being done by these superhero Muslims, as long as that prevails, then the government won't be held accountable, regardless of the fact that they broke the law of torturing, that they don't abide by the Constitution, that take away habeas corpus process, and all these other things. All of that is protected by this myth of 9/11. But if that myth gets exposed, then that would, like the collapse of the dollar, those two things would, either one of them, certainly both together, would halt the evil empire forever.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Rob. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for all you've done. Bye.